Hey y'all, welcome to Poli-Side-Eye, where we break down politics for the average Joe, Jamal, and Janet. I am here with my co-host Jared, who I've not seen in a very long time. How are you?
Pretty good. Just doing my thing, trying to keep up with politics and watching everything burn around us.
Right, and he has the guns out today so he can have y'all's full attention. Okay, don't do all that, okay? Look, making me look bad on my own channel. Uh, I was supposed to see you for the SZA concert.
Oh God, it still
Remember
has
that?
not been scheduled either. It's like she needs to get it together.
She really does, because I have not listened to her album since.
I have a feeling that. So I think the tour ends either this week or maybe last week. So my thought at first was like she's going to reschedule it to like the end of this leg of the tour, but I think she's going to do another leg probably like later in the summer, early fall, and just bundle the Philly dates in there. That's my guess. I don't have any. I'm just speculating. I have no way of knowing that
That's
because I feel
strike
like if
one.
we were going to be at the end of this leg, she would have announced it by now.
That's strike one for her. Really is. But in more pressing matters, me and Jared were texting like we normally do about random things. And, I get all my political info from him. And he said things are about to get really bad. And I'm just like, more bad news? Like, what's some good news that's going on?
Things are not as bad as I thought they might have been by now. I try not to be, I try to be hopeful about stuff, but there's just a lot of signs that are really troubling. I've been concerned about a lot of stuff for a minute now, but I feel like a lot of the things I've been concerned about are like all coming to a head at once.
Right. So things are about to get real bad concerning, politics and the economy. Is it a list of things or should we just start with like what should we start on?
So I would say first, one of the big concerns I have is the amount of debt that is currently existing in society. So the amount of debt that people hold has been steadily going up really since like the 70s, but it's been getting exponentially worse recently. So for example, I was reading the maybe like 2 days ago that the amount of auto loan defaults is like really spiking. Like a lot of people can't make their auto loan payments. Why? Because interest rates on on all loans, but even auto loans have gone up substantially over the last year or so. And so like a lot of people can't make those payments anymore. And so I've been concerned a lot about the amount of debt that's out there and just a number of other issues. So we can kind of talk about that later. But the thing that is most concerning to me is the fact that so much of that debt is systemic. So everything is operating based on that. So like people's retirement is based on the amount of debt that's just circulating in the economy. Obviously, you have issues with student loans. Those payments are about to start up again in the fall. So people are already struggling to make their car payments, keep up with their rent. And what are you going to do when you tell people that on top of all that, y'all have to start paying y'all student loans again?
And it's so easy to accrue debt. Just say if you want to like fly somewhere or just try to get that like special Amex to sit in the lounges or get a credit card for the sole reason of getting Beyonce tickets. And then I hear people's you say car notes are like $500, $600 a month.
Yeah, and it's going every time the Federal Reserve raises interest rates, and we can talk about if you care to like why that is, but every time they raise interest rates, that means the amount you're going to be paying for your car note is going to increase because most people's the interest on their car payments is not fixed. So unlike most mortgages where you have fixed interest rates, so regardless of what the Fed does, if you bought your home, let's say 2% interest rate, like that's going to stay. But if you bought your car, let's say in 2019, before the Fed started raising interest rates, and the interest on your car was, I don't know, 4%, if not, it might be 6, 7, 8, potentially 9% at some point if they just keep raising in the rate. So how are people going to keep up with that?
So all this debt accrued by the average person, like what effect does that have on all of us as a whole? Even people that aren't in debt.
I think it's important to think about, so what is debt? I don't think people have a good sense of like what debt is. I think mainly because people don't understand what money is. So money ultimately is just, it's not tangible. Like we have these things that we print called like dollars, But all of that is just a way of representing indebtedness, really. So if you want to buy Beyonce tickets and you maybe don't have enough from your normal wages, like how do you buy those tickets? A credit card, right?
Get a credit card.
Right.
I feel like I'm being read right now because that's
no, listen, I got tickets to Beyonce's concert too. I bought them on my, so like, listen, I'm not judging anybody. This is just using an example. Okay, the credit card that you're swiping to buy those tickets, yes, it's debt, so you're gonna have to pay it off eventually. But where is the money being loaned from?
I'm not sure. Like MasterCard or whoever supplies me with that money.
Right. So, okay, exactly. So how does banking work? So essentially banking works like this. We all pull our money in, when we get paid, we put our money in the wages we get, we put it in a bank because we think it's safer than putting it in a piggy bank or under our mattresses like our grandma used to do. So we are able to put our money in a bank and it is insured up to a certain amount. So in America, that's $250,000, which it's insured by the FDIC, which is the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. I don't remember what the C stands for, but the FDIC for short. So you know if you put the money in the bank, you know it's there. It's insured, like irrespective of what happens with the economy, it's going to be there. Now, what banks do to make money is when we put the money we get from our job in the banks lend that money out elsewhere. So they lend it out. Most banks have some form of like credit card program. So essentially they lend the money that we have deposited into these accounts out to other people. And it's not just our money that we input, like there's all other ways that banks essentially collect all of these deposits. But the money is often coming from wealthier people. So like most corporations, so banks, for instance, can issue what are called bonds. So bonds oftentimes are pretty much an IOU of sorts. So rich people will essentially lend their money to banks through the bonds with the guarantee that these bonds will be paid at a certain amount over a certain amount of time, and at a certain point in time, like you will have paid that all out. That's what they call when they say the bond is maturing. Now, the reason that debt is so important is because really how it functions is most of us who have to work for a living I don't have money to loan to people or to any of that shit. So like most of the debt that I'm holding, which is what you're doing when you use a credit card, you're holding debt, is really just rich people parasitically benefiting off of our spending behavior. So while we might extend that to, like, say, a Beyonce concert, which is how rich people like to make you think about that, they just make it seem like people are just spending on like frivolous stuff. Really, most people are indebted because they need to eat and because they need to pay their bills. So really what ends up happening is that debt is a way to transfer money from us to rich people, essentially. And now why that's important is because as society becomes, like you said to yourself, like once you start becoming in debt, it feels like it's harder and harder to get out of it. Well, that's kind of the point, because debt is, you don't just pay what you get, like you have to put interest towards it. So like if you swipe this card, like the tickets may have been $300, but if the interest rate is 22%, then you have to pay $300 plus the interest, which if your wages aren't increasing pretty much at a rate of 22%, that means you're falling behind. So every time, like as more and more people accrue debt, the inequality gets worse and worse, because the people who are loaning most of their money that banks are using to then dole out to other people are rich people.
Right.
That sounds innocuous enough, although people should be like, oh, this sounds kind of like a weird situation to be in. But what happens then when you have more and more and more and more people who rely on debt to live? Essentially, like you have growing inequality. You have more and more people who need the debt to survive. And then fewer and fewer people are at the top who can actually like dole out the money to be used as debt, which is very, very destabilizing. So to tie that into what happened recently, what we saw with like Silicon Valley Bank is essentially what I just described in microcosm. You have all of these wealthy investors who stored their money in Silicon Valley Bank. Silicon Valley Bank, what did they do? They made loans to people. But when the economy tanks, again, it's Silicon Valley Bank, so many of their clients were from what? The tech industry. The tech industry has been laying people off left and right, which means you have far less people who can make those types of deposits, which means the bank becomes less and less liquid. So what ends up happening is that investors, the rich people, saw what was going on at Silicon Valley Bank and were like, oh, fuck, like, let me pull my money out before this bank goes bust. So all of these rich investors did what's called a bank run, when they just go to the bank and pull all their money out of the bank. And so the bank pretty much almost overnight was just completely bust. Like, it had literally no money because all these rich people had taken out. So what happens? So the government has to step in and essentially is going to print all of this money to essentially make sure that people who deposited money in Silicon Valley Bank, most of whom are rich people, that gets left out of the news, but it's mainly rich people, can actually access the money that the bank doesn't no longer had to actually give back to them because they had loaned it out. So you can easily see why debt as a system of organizing social affairs becomes really destabilizing really quickly.
I love this full circle moment because I understood everything you said. you need you need to teach because wow.
I do teach. That's what I get paid to do.
Oh, right. I'm tired. That was good because I have some follow-up questions. So did some people actually lose their money? Like, they're insured for like $250K, but I'm sure they put millions in. Like, you just SOL?
So that's the gag. So the government, the Treasury, the FDIC, and the Federal Reserve are all intervening to essentially print money. Literally just I just was reading about it earlier today. Tomorrow, they being depositors will be able to go to the Federal. So the Federal Reserve, it's in a nutshell, it's just pretty much the nation's bank, essentially. Like, anytime there's some type of like banking crash, it's kind of a lender. They call it a lender of last resort. So if banks fail, or if there's an issue like what we're confronting right now, the Federal Reserve pretty much steps in and says, all right, cool, like, we'll just give y'all the money, because you've heard the whole like saying too big to fail. So the idea being like, oh, we'll just print all this money. Depositors who deposited more money than the $250,000 cutoff, like, if they made deposits, they'll have access to it because we'll print the money and just give it to them. So if they weren't willing to do that, yes, these investors would have lost anything they deposit above $250,000, which like 80% of depositors were wealthy depositors who had more than that and deposited in Silicon Valley Bank, they would have.
But isn't this quick fix almost like putting a Band-Aid on a gunshot wound?
Oh, absolutely. It's going to make things actually worse for most of us, because we have another issue that the Federal Reserve and the Treasury has not addressed, which is the inflation. So inflation is still really high right now. Some things have come down a little bit. So energy prices, after they spiked in like the late summer, early fall, have come down. So gas is still inflated, but not as high as it was, like, say, 4 or 5 months ago. But food prices are still inflated, especially if you go to like a restaurant. Like, the amount you pay for food is still substantially higher now compared to a year ago. But the two areas where inflation has not been addressed is housing. So housing inflation is like 70 and 80% higher than it was before the pandemic. So, like, I don't know what you're going to do about that. But you also have, I kind of already mentioned it, but food inflation. So food inflation, although prices have stabilized, they're still inflated. But the Federal Reserve has explicitly said that they can't do anything about that. But the reason what they're doing with the bailout, that's going to make things worse, is because the way that they're bailing these rich depositors out is by like printing money. So you're printing money and just injecting it into an already inflated economy. If people have this money in their hands now, what are they going to do? Probably spend it. And so, like, you're going to exacerbate the existing inflation, because during an inflation, the last thing you want to do is like print more money, because the issue with inflation is you already have too much money circulating within the economy as it is. And so now by printing more of it, it's just going to keep things inflated. On one hand, you're trying to address one issue, which is the banking crisis, but the way you do that is going to exacerbate the inflation crisis. So I don't know how you get out of those two things.
So what is the absolute like worst case scenario that people should be afraid of? Like, what can happen, or what's likely to happen if we keep going at this rate?
So I think the thing that people will feel most, and you're probably already seeing it if you live in a big city, or not even a big city, but just a city period. Cities are broke. Like, let me just put it straight up. They are broke. How does New York fund its day-to-day like affairs? Like, how do you wake up in New York and make sure that I was about to say make sure the trash is picked up, but it's New York. But in most places, how do you ensure that the trash is picked up, that you have a somewhat functioning school system, that you have roads that are functional, that you have pretty much all the electricity is like all of the general infrastructure and the day-to-day stuff that goes into making a city tick? You need money to do that. Generally, the way that most cities, up until about the early 1970s, maybe a little bit earlier than that, most of them generated the money based on tax revenues. So like the amount you pay in like property taxes. So if you own a home, you pay a certain amount of tax that goes to the city. If you shop, if you eat out, like you pay sales tax, all that goes into the general fund for like making sure that the city is functioning and well oiled. But when the economy gets worse, if people lose their jobs, what happens? Well, you lose tax revenue, because if people don't have income, then they're not spending as much. When they're not going out as much, they're not spending as much as sales tax. They're probably not buying homes. So, you don't have that property tax coming in. So cities become strapped of revenue. Mm-hmm. So the way that they offset that budget shortfall is by, again, going back to what I was saying earlier, they issue bonds. So essentially cities are like, okay, we don't have enough money from taxes, so we're going to issue bonds and essentially accept rich people's money and then promise to pay these rich people back with interest over time. So as cities lose more and more of the tax revenue, they have to issue more and more bonds to like make up for what they otherwise would have been getting in tax revenue. So like in New York, I keep using New York as an example because that's where you live. So the subway, for instance, is heavily indebted. Why? Because a vast majority of its operating budget is based on, it comes from bonds. They get the money from the rich people, and then they have to pay back the rich people with interest so that the rest of us can have a way to get to work. It's a ridiculous, like outrageous system. And part of the reason this happens is because rich people do not want to pay taxes. So they pay many lobbyists handsomely to essentially coerce political leaders not to tax them, so that political leaders then have no choice but to like essentially take their money and then pay them back in interest when they could just be taxed in the first place, and we wouldn't be beholden to rich people in the way that we are. But we have a society where we're all beholden to, not like all, but like maybe the top 7% of us are all beholden to rich people because we depend on debt to like eat. And so a really indebted society like this is a direct outcome of living in a really exploitative, grossly unequal society. And it doesn't have to be this way. It's this way because we've organized society in a way that we all just show deference to rich people and just let them dictate how policy is going to be oriented, pretty much.
That's some depressing stuff.
A lot of this could be solved pretty easily. Like if we taxed assets, for instance, at a reasonable rate, that could generate a ton of revenue. Like you pay more in taxes than Jeff Bezos probably does. The way that our tax system is structured is wealth is generally taxed at a much lower rate than is like income. So the amount you get in wages is usually taxed more than what if you, let's say, bought a whole bunch of stocks and like traded in the stock market. The amount you pay in taxes on stocks and bonds is lower than what you pay out of your paycheck when you go to work. So we have a system that is structured to benefit or prop up the wealth of a handful of people at the expense of everybody else.
Like the system is just not fair. It just feels like, okay, so things just going to keep getting higher. People are probably going to have to like get second, maybe third jobs. Some people may be homeless.
Yeah, I mean, the Federal Reserve. So part of the reason the Federal Reserve is raising interest rates is because they believe that the best way to address inflation. So what is inflation? The classic definition is too many dollars chasing too few goods. For the case of COVID, part of the reason that people say we had this inflation is because, people were locked up for 6 months. And so when things opened back up, you had all this like pent up demand. And so you couldn't keep up with all of the demand for travel, for eating out, for commodities, all these other things. So what happens? Well, these businesses raise the price because the demand was there there, and they knew they could do it because people wanted to go on these vacations, they wanted to take these trips. So there was some very explicit price gouging, and I mean, corporations are very open about this. If you listen to like their earnings calls, they're just like, yeah, we're jacking up the price because people keep paying it. So like, of course we're going to charge $600 for a Beyonce ticket because y'all gonna play it, period. And we can do it because we're a monopoly and y'all don't have no other choice. They're explicitly saying that. What the Federal Reserve tried to do to like suppress demand, they were like, well, if we raise interest rates, so again, this is interest on pretty much any type of debt that you have, with the exception of mortgages, because mortgages for the most part are fixed rate. Once you buy your house, all but like 10% of people have a fixed mortgage, but everybody else, like if you have credit card debt, you have an auto loan, any of that, the interest is going up on it. The idea being, well, eventually people will cut back on spending because they're not going to be able to keep up with the existing payments that they have. And this is the crazy part, businesses, because this affects not just individual consumers, but also businesses as well. They're like, well, now since businesses are going to have to pay more for the products that they need to run their business, they're not going to have as much money to like pay workers. So then they're going to have to lay people off. Well, if they lay people off, then because we'll have more unemployed people, you'll have less purchasing power because people won't get to spend money if you don't have a job. And because there's more unemployment, the people who do have a job are going to be less willing to demand higher wages because they might be like, oh, fuck, I might be next. So let me just shut up and go to work, because if I try to make too much of a hoopla over this, they might fire me too. So the idea that the Federal Reserve has is like, well, let's just keep jacking up interest rates, get unemployment a little bit higher. Even if that means causing some homelessness, so be it. But that's the only way that we can combat inflation. But it hasn't worked. And why hasn't it worked? Because as I said earlier, most of the inflation is on food and housing. And like, it doesn't matter. You need a place to live and you need food. So like, people are gonna pay for that. And so the strategy they had never made sense to me. And now it's only going to be worse because of what I was saying about Silicon Valley Bank, which is the solution to that was just to print more money. And the whole point of raising interest rates is to tighten spending. So now you're putting more money into an economy that you're trying to contract. It's important to understand what capitalism is. Capitalism is a system that is designed to produce wealth and redistribute it upwards, essentially. Because the whole point of capitalism when it arose was to essentially give the bourgeoisie an opportunity to accrue wealth through the acquisition of private property and not have to labor. Like, that's the whole point. Like, they don't want to labor. They don't want to work, which is the gag, because they're the ones who create all of these ideologies around, oh, if you just work hard, you can succeed. And they don't work. They don't want to work, because the whole point of capitalism is so they don't have to work. The whole point is for them to force us to work so they can redirect all of the things that we produce upwards to themselves. That's literally the whole point of capitalism.
The game is fixed, and I just see like the average person on a hamster wheel with a little water on the side, as like they're in this little cage as rich people are watching them run on these hamster wheels.
I mean, that's kind of what it is, to be quite honest. So I just want to make one point about money and debt, because I said something earlier that I think needs to be clarified. So I said that rich people issue their money in the form of bonds or loans. But that's not quite true, because it's not their money. They are exploiting the value that we produce as laborers and hoarding it for themselves and calling it wealth. So I just think that needed to be said, because I think it's really easy to think that like rich people are doing us a favor, or they're, being charitable with their money, but they're not. What they're doing is they are systematically finding ways to not pay taxes, and then starving institutions, mainly local governments and even the federal government, but not exclusively, but starving institutions of money that we need to survive for ourselves, our family, on a day-to-day basis, simply because they have erected a system that is literally all about them not having to labor, so they can appropriate the value that we produce. That's capitalism in a nutshell. And so I think that needs to be said over and over, because the way that we talk about wealth makes it seem like it's just something that's just out there. But wealth is a relationship. Wealth and debt is a relationship. All debt is saying that there are either institutions or individuals in which one person is being expected to labor and give a part of that labor or the proceeds of that labor to somebody else for no other reason at all than because we have this idea that, oh, because somebody like stands on something, they can just call it their own property. And then as a result, like we just have to pay them something just by owning it. Like it's actually a very wild system, but we've been socialized to view it as natural. Think about that for a second. We literally live in a system where people can lay claim to land. Nobody produces land. You didn't make that. Like, but you think that you can just step foot on it, plant your flag, and then tell anybody that has access to that they have to pay you a rent to access it? Like that is the wildest thing ever. And so the rest of us have to take on all of this debt to just be able to eat and like put a roof over our head. I don't know. To me, that sounds absurd, but maybe not to other people. I leave it up to the viewer to decide whether or not they think that's absurd. But I think it's downright unjust, to be honest.
So is all this solvable? Like, what is Biden doing about this? Are we able to do anything, like just the average person by voting, or what?
There actually are things that we could do, probably not things we want to do. So on the inflation piece, there are things we could do. We could just like not consume as much. That requires a much bigger like philosophical change, but it's possible. Like most of these airlines, if you listen to like, because I'm lame like this, I listen to earnings calls because I just like to hear what corporations are talking about. If you listen to the airlines, they're like, oh yeah, this trip that we used to charge like $180 round trip ticket for, oh, we're charging $400. Why? Oh, because we can, because people keep buying the tickets. So, but the thing is, like, it's a certain segment of the population that's buying the stuff. And so we really have a 3-tiered economy. We have like the very, very rich, like what we call like the 1%, like you always hear AOC and Bernie and all them talking about. Like, so they're kind of the upper echelon. Like they're the people who really don't do shit. Like they don't work. Most of their money just comes from just like passive income, which again, passive income is a farce. There's no such thing as passive income. It's called exploitation. But I'll be generous and call it passive income. That's where they get most of it from. Then you have like, I would say the next maybe 15% of the population. So these are people who aren't super wealthy, but they're comfortable enough to where the inflation might be annoying. Like you might get annoyed that, oh, I used to be able to buy this drink for like $14, but now it's 17. Or, oh, this Uber trip used to be like 15, but now it's like 23. Like that might annoy you, but it's not going to systematically change your behavior, at least not in a qualitative way. But then for other people, for the rest of the population, like this is downright destructive. Like this is why you're seeing in many cities that crime is on the rise. You're seeing much more car break-ins. You're seeing, because all of that is a direct outcome of the economy. Like as more and more people are in a precarious situation or homeless, they're going to get more and more desperate. That's going to be more and more of a strain on services, which, as I already explained to you, cities are already broke as it is. So now you're going to have more people needing services at a time that there's also an inflation, and you have a Federal Reserve that is committed to like making more and more people unemployed to solve the inflation issue, which, as I said before, is not going to happen. So they're just exacerbating the problem, all because they don't want to stand up to rich people and corporations. Why? Because they're also rich. So, but there are things we could do. We could demand that, I think, again, taxation is not going to fix everything, but it could help a great deal. Like if the top 1%, as I was saying, or like even the top 15% of people, if they could pay a little bit more, that includes myself. I'm pretty sure I'm probably the lower end of that 15, but I can stand to pay more in tax. If we all like collectively paid just a little bit more, that could solve not everything, but I would say like a quarter of the issues. And that quarter could be enough to like give us some breathing room to like actually start to think about like new ways forward. But it's hard to do that when people are just struggling to make ends meet. And so, but that's going to require us to hold political leaders to account and essentially stand up to rich people. But it's just hard to do that because rich people control the media, they control institutions, they control all of these spaces. And so I think many of us are fearful of standing up to them because they know that ultimately they control the purse strings. But I don't really think there's any way around that. So I do think that there are things that we could do. The question is, are there enough of us who have the will or willing to potentially absorb the losses that might come with standing up to rich people? And I think that's an open question. So I'll just leave it there.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for breaking all this down. It seemed like a lot of this is concerning, like, it needs change to policy. I feel like we're still caught in that back and forth between the Senate and the House not getting anything done and having a majority conservative Supreme Court. A lot of things aren't going to be settled because conservatives still have hands in everything, even though we have a Democratic president.
Yeah, I mean, the Democrats, they're also some of the ones who said, I mean, Janet Yellen is the Secretary of the Treasury. She's a Democrat, and she's also like, yeah, we need to unemploy people. So it's not even just like a partisan, we need people unemployed. Like, it's not even just a partisan thing. It's really a class thing. Like, wealthy people control the institutions in this country, and they craft policy that serves their interests, which in this case is preserving their wealth. And so yes, it's a policy question. Yes, it's definitely an electoral question, but that's only one piece of it, which is why I said that would only solve probably like a quarter of the issues, because really the bigger issue is, this is my book recommendation for the day, called The Sickness is the System. Like, capitalism as a mode of organization is about having the mass of the population generate wealth for the bourgeoisie. It's not just the implementation of policy, it's implicating the entire legal system, the electoral system, policies, the tax system. All of that needs to be reevaluated. And yeah, so we have our work cut out for us.
Indeed. Well, that was the book title, y'all. Sickness in the System.
The sickness is the system.
Got it.
Capitalism fails to save us from pandemics or itself. It's a very well-written, very easy to follow book. So I would highly recommend that.
Yeah, I'll put that in the description. This was a good talk, and it may have put a fear of God in some people. Maybe. Hopefully, y'all learned something. I think y'all did, because I definitely learned a lot. Where can they follow you?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter. JC Tiger Fan, JAYC Tiger Fan. Also Instagram.
And also, if y'all have a question or anything, you can put it in the comments. And I'm sure Jared checks in the videos every now and then, so you can ask him. So yeah, I guess we'll see y'all for another, impending crisis.
Hopefully I'll have better news to report next time. I try not to be a Debbie Downer, but this was the hand I was dealt.
Yeah, I also wanted to get your feedback, maybe in a later episode, about the outlaw on race theory in schools, like just interfering in education, as well as, like, I'm sure you heard about outlawing drag shows and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we can talk about that next time.
All right, y'all. Well, that was our show, and we will see y'all for the next episode. Bye.